You already knew something was different about you. Maybe you couldn't explain it. Maybe you still can't. But somewhere between the noise of other people's certainty and the quiet of your own mind, you've always sensed it, a strange distance between how others move through the world and how you do. And sometimes that distance felt like loneliness. This isn't about IQ scores. It's not about grades or achievements or who reads the most books. This is about a particular kind of mind, one that processes the world more slowly, more deeply, and more painfully than it probably wants to. And if you've ever felt exhausted by thinking, if you've ever stayed up past midnight replaying a conversation that happened 3 years ago, if you've ever felt too much and said too little, then this might be the most honest thing you've heard in a while, because here's what nobody tells you about genuine intelligence. It isn't a superpower. Most of the time, it feels like a wound. Highly intelligent people almost never react immediately, not because they don't feel. They feel everything, sometimes far too much, but there's a gap, a small, almost invisible pause between the emotion and the response. Other people might call them cold, reserved, hard to read, but that pause isn't emptiness, it's the opposite. It's a mind that's already running 3 steps ahead, asking what is actually happening here, beneath what's being said. Think of it like this. Most people see the surface of a lake and take a photograph. The intelligent mind keeps staring, watching the water move, trying to understand what's underneath. That's not detachment, that's depth. And depth takes time. But here's the part nobody mentions. That pause costs something. Because while you're processing, the world has already moved on, and you're left carrying the weight of a moment that everyone else has already forgotten. They rarely argue to win either. This one surprises people, because the assumption is that a sharp mind loves a good debate, and yes, they can argue brilliantly. But the ones who've developed real emotional and intellectual depth, they've learned that winning an argument almost never changes the other person's mind. It only closes them off. They've learned the hard way that being right is not the same as being understood. And being understood matters more to them than being correct. There's a grief in that, actually. Because if you've ever been the smartest person in a room and felt completely alone in it, you know exactly what I mean. The mind that can see every angle, every flaw in every argument, that mind often goes silent. Not because it has nothing to say, but because it's learned that saying it only increases the distance. And that silence begins very early in life. Much earlier than most people realize. Because highly intelligent people rarely experience their childhood as simple. Not because it was necessarily traumatic, though sometimes it was, but because the world they were handed didn't quite fit the way their mind worked. Questions that felt urgent to them were dismissed. Emotions that ran deep were called dramatic. Observations that were accurate were called rude. So they learned to fold themselves smaller. They learned that the safest version of themselves was the quiet one, the helpful one, the one who watched from the edges and never asked for too much. And here's what that does to a person. It creates a habit of self-erasure so practiced, so automatic, that by adulthood they can't even recognize when they're doing it anymore. This is the invisible wound that nobody sees, not in the report cards or the accomplishments, but in the private moments, in the hesitation before they speak. In the way they apologize for having needs at all. They almost never take things at face value. Every interaction carries layers for them. Every silence has meaning. Every phrasing is noted. And while this makes them extraordinary at understanding people, it also makes them exhausting to be inside of. Because they're always reading, always interpreting, always asking, what did that really mean? This isn't paranoia. It's a survival skill that was developed in environments where the surface of things couldn't be trusted, where what was said and what was meant were often very different, where love had conditions hidden inside it, where safety required reading the room before entering it. The mind that learned to decode the world as a child never fully stops decoding, and you carry that with you. Into every relationship, every new place, every phone call that takes a second too long to begin. The blessing is that almost nothing escapes your notice. The burden is that rest becomes almost impossible. And then there's something that might sting a little. Highly intelligent people rarely seek validation out loud. but they hunger for it in silence. This is the contradiction that lives at the center of this kind of mind. The external presentation is confidence, self-sufficiency, independence of thought. They seem like they don't need anyone's approval, and they've spent years training themselves to appear that way. But underneath that presentation, there's a child who was made to feel that their needs were too much, that their questions were inconvenient, that their sensitivity was a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be nurtured. So the need for validation didn't disappear, it just went underground. It transformed into perfectionism, into overachievement, into never being able to rest in what they've already done, because the internal critic never went quiet. This is not a flaw. Please hear that clearly. This is what happens when a deeply feeling person learns to survive in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with them. The hunger for validation was always legitimate. It was the response to it that became the problem. They rarely stay in situations that have stopped making sense, but they stay far longer than they should trying to make sense of them. They are, by nature, seekers of meaning, and meaning has a cost. Because when something stops making sense, a relationship, a friendship, a career, a version of themselves, they don't just leave. They analyze, they revisit. They build entire architecture around the why. Other people can walk away. This kind of mind needs to understand before it can release. And sometimes that understanding never fully comes, and the inability to release without understanding becomes its own prison. Think about the last time you couldn't let something go, not because you were weak, but because your mind refused to accept that some things don't have a satisfying explanation, that some people leave without a reason that will ever make complete sense, that some chapters end mid-sentence. The intelligent mind resists that, and the resistance is exhausting. They rarely pretend to be fine when they aren't, but they become extraordinary at performing fineness for the comfort of everyone around them. This is the layer that most people never see, because from the outside they look composed, capable, like they've figured something out that the rest of the world hasn't. But inside, there's a constant negotiation between the self that is hurting and the self that has learned, again from very early on, that falling apart makes other people uncomfortable. So they hold it. They hold it in meetings and in conversations and in the middle of the night when everything they've been managing finally catches up to them. And when they finally do let something slip, a moment of real vulnerability, a crack in the composure, they immediately apologize for it. They call it too much. They shrink back into performance mode before anyone even has the chance to simply sit with them. This is the loneliness that never gets named. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. They rarely allow themselves to not know something. There is a particular shame they carry around uncertainty, around incompleteness, around the possibility that they might have gotten something wrong. And the reason for this goes back much further than adulthood. For many of them, their intelligence was the thing that gave them value. In a world where they felt too much, thought too differently, and took up too much emotional space, being smart was the one thing that made them safe, that made them worth keeping around. So not knowing became dangerous. Being wrong became dangerous. And the pressure they place on their own mind is not ambition, it's armor. Understanding that distinction changes everything, because you can take off armor when you're safe. And part of healing, the slow, unsteady, non-linear kind, is learning to identify the places where you are actually safe. The relationships, the moments, the versions of yourself where you don't have to know everything, where you're allowed to be uncertain, where getting it wrong doesn't mean losing love. Those places exist, even if you haven't fully believed that yet. And finally, this is the one that brings everything full circle. Highly intelligent people almost never fully accept how rare their way of experiencing the world actually is. They spend so much of their lives feeling like failures, like they're doing something wrong, like everyone else has access to a manual they were never given. And in their loneliness, they often conclude that the problem must be them. But the problem was never them. The problem was the gap between a mind that moves in depth and a world that mostly moves in speed. between a heart that feels in detail and a culture that rewards those who don't feel too much, between a person who needed to be known and environments that only had room for the version of them that was useful. That gap is real, and it created real pain, and the pain was never a sign of weakness. It was the natural consequence of being a certain kind of person in a world that wasn't quite built for you. Here is what I want you to hold on to. The things that made your life harder, the overthinking, the sensitivity, the inability to let things go, the silence that holds more than most people say out loud. These are not your failures. They are the evidence of a mind that cares, deeply, sometimes unbearably, but genuinely, and healing. For this kind of mind doesn't look like becoming simpler. It doesn't look like caring less or feeling less or analyzing less. It looks like learning, slowly, imperfectly, with many setbacks, that you are allowed to exist as fully as you actually are. That your depth is not a burden someone needs to carry. It's something worth knowing. That the pause before you speak is not weakness. It's wisdom learning to trust itself. That the hunger for understanding, the refusal to stay in what doesn't make sense, the inability to perform fineness when you are not fine, these are not flaws to be corrected. They are the shape of an honest soul. And there is a version of your life where you stop spending your energy trying to become less of what you are, where you let the pause be the pause, where you let the depth be the depth, where you stop apologizing for the way your mind moves through the world and start slowly, carefully, building a life that has room for all of it. That version of your life is not a fantasy. It starts with the recognition, the quiet, difficult, world-shifting recognition that you were never broken. You were just trying to survive in a space too small for everything you carry, and you deserve more space than that.